Hello and welcome to our video on topics 2 and 3 with Great Britain. All right, so topic 2 deals specifically with political and economic change, and that's an area that Great Britain has experienced a great deal of change over the last 30 years. If we go back and we take a long view of Great Britain, we will see that gradualism is or has been a component of the change in Great Britain for a very long time. Again, in Great Britain, we don't see some of the more tumultuous changes of revolution, but we do see the pressure of multiple instances and events and time periods having great impact on the development of the political system and also economic change in Britain. As you can take a look on the slide, you'll see that there are things like the transition from the monarchy into a parliamentary system, the pressures of the Industrial Revolution, imperialism, Britain's position in the world at the beginning of the 20th century, the impact of both World War I and World War II on Britain, and then most recently the economic crises of the 70s and 80s are kind of highlights that have really driven a lot of the changes and a lot of the decision making in Britain over time. One of the other things we'll take a look at in terms of political change is voting. One of the things we can draw out and get a similarity with the United States over a very long period of time, gradually, Britain has modified its suffrage system and steadily added more people, classes, and women to their voting process. So there's a similarity that you can draw with the United States. All right, so the first big change we'll talk about here is the influence of the common man, and that begins if we go back to the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century with the Industrial Revolution. The House of Commons is going to gain predominance in the bicameral legislature, in Parliament, at this time. They're going to push basically that House of Lords, that upper house, to the side, and they're going to have most of the power. The House of Lords at this point, and even today, really only has the power to delay legislation. All of the power really is in the House of Commons in Parliament. This kind of all happens at the same time. You see the creation of the Labour Party in 1906 with an emphasis and demand for change, greater access to services, more protection from the government. And they will be the first to really bring up the ideas that we will see later with the collective consensus after World War I and World War II on how to better take care of people. Britain will also deal with a loss of prestige after World War II, being the predominant power at the beginning of the 20th century. And after the draining wars of World War I and World War II, Britain will have a different place in the world. All of those things together, pressures of the Industrial Revolution, wars, the new Labour Party, are going to force, maybe not so much force, but are going to push Britain towards what's called the collective consensus, where the two parties, Labour and Conservative parties, are going to get together and form, and basically, I'm not going to say a coalition because they are going to share power and the prime ministers will change between parties, but they're going to have a common direction or force that's going to push them forward. And that's called the collective consensus, and that's going to last from the end of World War II all the way through the 1960s with this widespread support for the creation of this modern welfare system. And this modern welfare system is going to include really popular things even today, the National Health System, or Service, excuse me, that is going to provide health care for all Brits, subsidies for education and housing. The Beveridge Report that you'll see mentioned there on the slide is a report that was done that kind of showed where Britain lagged in terms of its people and social services, and it was going to form the foundation for the creation of some of these other welfare systems and the welfare state. And that welfare state will be rounded out and paid for with the use of a mixed economy, where the British government was going to control the prime movers in the economy with coal and steel, and they were going to manage a lot like a command economy. They still had a great deal of private property and entrepreneurship, but the government did take over a lot of those major industries and businesses and manage them. And again, from watching those video clips from the Commanding Heights, you'll see that story in video. All right, some other challenges. You know, the collective consensus, everything's going to go great for the 40s, 50s, into the 1960s. By the time we get to the 1970s, you're going to see the consensus begin to break apart. And you're going to see conservatives and Labour move away from each other. They're going to have differing views. You're going to see the conservatives move more to the right. And you're going to see the Labour Party move even farther to the left into the more socialist realm of the political spectrum. And this is really going to be forced by the 1970s and some of the issues that come up in the 70s. We know the oil crises and OPEC are going to have a big impact on Britain. The strikes that are going to pop up with the labor unions demanding higher pay and better services. So that's going to really bring Britain to kind of a crisis point and a call for change. This is going to begin in the early 1970s and really culminate in the late 1970s, where you see Margaret Thatcher, also known as the Iron Lady, really come to predominance and power. She becomes prime minister, has a very rocky start, and then things start to go her way. She's going to push what's called neoliberalism. This is a word that you might not have, we haven't talked about yet, but that's really a movement back to some of the traditional liberal ideas of lower regulation, lower taxes, and more freedoms. And that's really going to form the core of what Thatcher is going to bring. It's going to be a turn away from the socialist and the huge social welfare state and the mixed economy to more individualism, privatization, entrepreneurship, shrinking regulation, shrinking government, and trying to activate those prime movers in the economy, again, to kind of jumpstart. And that is in tandem with what Ronald Reagan was doing in the United States at the same time with cutting taxes and ending deregulation. They're very similar in the way that they are going to attack some of these problems that face both the United States, Great Britain, and many countries around the world. All right, it's that movement from the idea of Keynesian economic theory with throwing money at a problem and spending your way out versus the Hayek, which you're going to see in the video, model of allowing the markets to operate, allowing supply and demand and privatization to run the show. Now, Margaret Thatcher is going to have a great legacy because you will see today, 30 years after she was prime minister, Britain still is moving forward with a more privatized economy. They still have the social welfare state, and it's still very popular in Britain. But again, it's very different from that total welfare state that we had through the 50s, 60s, and into the 1970s. All right, so after we have Margaret Thatcher, she's going to be succeeded by John Major. John Major is going to hold on. The Conservatives are going to remain in power, but their majorities in Parliament are going to begin to slide a little bit. You're going to see people become a little disillusioned. And then eventually Labour is going to modify its political stance, and they're going to move from the left more to the center. So they're going to leave some of those more radical socialist ideas to the left, and they're going to move to the center. And that's going to culminate with the election of Tony Blair and the Labour Party and Tony Blair as prime minister in 1997. He was going to win that election with the idea of this new Labour Party, which was going to combine the best of what the Conservatives had to offer and what Labour had to offer. And he's going to have good success between 1997 all the way up into the early 2000s. He's really going to get tripped up by the the Iraq War invasion of Iraq by the United States, which was supported by Britain and Tony Blair. It was a big political risk, and it didn't really work out for him because over time the British became not so excited about British involvement in Iraq, and that eventually would force Tony Blair to step down. Gordon Brown will replace him as another Labour prime minister, but you'll notice that his popularity is going to basically incite a steady decline and a dissatisfaction with the Labour Party. So you can see here, beginning with Thatcher, we do have Conservative, Labour, and now today we actually have from 2010, the last elections for Parliament, we had the Conservatives re-emerge, but not as a majority. They actually had to create a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, and you'll see David Cameron is the current prime minister. The cool thing is we're due for a brand new election here in 2015, and it'll be interesting to see how the government aligns itself. Coalition governments are not or have not been very popular over the two-party history of Britain, so it'll be interesting to see whether the coalition maintains or one of the two major parties emerges as a majority. All right, so the next topic we're going to move into here is the third topic. This is citizen, society, and state. So we're going to talk about some issues surrounding citizens, where they live, and the way the state kind of deals with some of those internal issues. Britain, as you know, has a very homogeneous culture. They have a common language across all of the parts of what we call the United Kingdom. They do have some cleavages, which is this is a good spot to mention them. You have your social class has always been a big cleavage, a determining factor in society. You also have the emergence of both race and ethnicity with Muslims, particularly in Britain and other minorities, and then also the Protestant Catholic conflicts in Northern Ireland. And those have really not been a huge factor in recent years, but in the 1970s and 80s, those were a huge division there in Northern Ireland. Great Britain is multinational, and again, I'm going to interchange Great Britain with the United Kingdom, and this is the difference. The island itself, Wales, Scotland, and Britain together, is what we call Great Britain. And when you add in Northern Ireland, which is on that other little island, the island there to the west, we get the United Kingdom. So all parts have a different national identities. Even though they are homogeneous, they have some national identities. We have England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and those 4 parts comprise the United Kingdom. The island part, which would be England, Wales, and Scotland, is called Great Britain. All right, one of the big issues, again, that I already mentioned here is social class. And this is the biggest division or cleavage in British society. It's been that way for a very long time. You do see this division. We have an upper class, and then you have this division between, your upper class would be more your connections to the monarchy. You're very rich, you're very affluent, and then that steps down into your middle class, which is going to be your white-collar workers, professionals, and then your lower, your working class, is going to be your blue-collar section. In a lot of cases, these social classes are reinforced by education over time. There was a very intricate system of public schools, and we mean public schools in Britain. We mean public schools that would prepare originally young men for public service, to serve in the military, to serve in parliament, to serve in the bureaucracy. And again, those were kind of your way or your path to maintain that position. You also have an upper class in terms of university called Oxbridge, and Oxbridge is the combination of Cambridge and Oxford together. And again, this was really for a very long time reserved for only the most affluent members of British society. Now, that changed a little bit with the collective consensus, and after World War II, there were opportunities for the lower classes to attend these universities, and much of the education in Great Britain is subsidized as part of the social welfare system for students, but you do have to meet some requirements in order to move forward with your university education. All right, the next part here is our ethnic minorities. Just to put this perspective, only about 7% of the British population has a non-European origin. So again, very homogeneous, but the ethnic piece of the population in Great Britain and the United Kingdom is growing. It's very young, and we also see a growing Muslim population inside Britain. Again, we're talking about a very small piece, but it is a growing piece. And it's been tough. The British haven't done a very good job adjusting to immigration. There is a very distinct minority-majority cleavage between those groups because, again, when you look at Britain, they are so very much the same. If you bring someone from outside of Europe, there's going to be a very stark contrast. One of the big or more specific pressures is the Muslims in Britain generally are not very affluent and comprise one of the lower classes in the social structure. A lot of the Muslims that have come to Great Britain are from Pakistan, and there is kind of this negativity that's attached with Osama bin Laden in Pakistan and these immigrants. There's also was a strong opposition to the Iraq War, which was originally supported by the people of Britain. And then finally, there's very little integration in the mainstream culture. They've created communities and really live independently. There really isn't that melting pot has not taken place at this point. All right, some political beliefs. Again, foundations here, trust and harmony. You'll see those bolded there, and for a very long time, that was really it. People trusted in Parliament. They trusted in their leadership. And that's pretty consistent even today. It's still there, but it has been tested. There's been a bunch of challenges, as we talked about before, in the 1970s and 80s. And the politics of protest have become much more prominent, where the British do speak out. They do protest. For a very long time, they kind of stayed in their lane and went along with what the leadership decided. And again, beginning in the 1970s, you do see the British beginning to step outside of that. Some of the pressures, we've talked about these already. Labor unions in decline. Some of the violence in Northern Ireland that they experienced in the 70s and 80s. Thatcher's policies, which really ran counter to some of the traditional ideals in British society. The creation of that new Labour Party, moving away from socialism, actually weakened the welfare state, and there's a block of people in Britain who are not really excited about that. And then eventually their entry into supporting the United States in the invasion of Iraq, and then the push back from the people, which would lead to Tony Blair's stepping down as Prime Minister. All right, last slide here. Voting behavior. 70% is the general turnout, but we've seen a steady decline over the last 3 national parliamentary elections. Class is still the biggest dividing factor on people vote, but it's not as definitive as it once was, similar to the United States. Some will follow their parents' socialization, and if the party's moving to the center, it's kind of blurred those lines. You'll notice there by region, labor, industrial areas, and conservatives in and around London. Thanks for watching the video. Make sure that you complete the Google form.